he probably, that I saw, he was always a little bit spotty on whether or not he'd come to class because he had, whatever PhD stuff over the top of it. But the couple times that he did come after or around that time period, I remember him, he had like a little bit more facial hair, just like stubble, but definitely less like well kept than he was. And he was a little quieter. He used to stand up at the start of class and like talk about some stuff sometimes. And this time he didn't really do that at all. He was definitely, I think, like the previous like mental preoccupation that we had been noticing where it was like, he didn't really want to be there. That was at like an all-time high. And he just, didn't look like he was doing great.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Talk about irony. It appears that a killer has come out of a criminology class, a criminology field at university level. And you've got all of these people that are now providing behavioral analysis, including Hayden Stinchfield. That was his voice that you heard, and it's what he told CNN. I'll provide a link to the rest of what he said. It's about 5 minutes long in the description of this video. Hayden Stinchfield also provides a scenario, an anecdote, where pretty much just before the crimes happened or shortly before they happened, he was brought into the class, and about half of a class of 150 students were asked to basically go at him, basically argue for why they should get higher grades. And if you think about just what a sort of weak individual he is, you can imagine how rifling that was, how that must have agitated him. That's about 75 students criticizing him. And it seems like that may have led to something. His grading changed. It took an about turn. And at the same time, he seemed to internalize. He became preoccupied and he appeared less well kept. And Stinchfield seems to think that that reached a peak at around about the time of the crime. He said they did notice that it seemed like he didn't really want to be there. What a crazy, crazy situation. So we are learning more about Kohberger from his classmates. We're also learning more about him from his neighbors. The one area that we're not really learning anything about is from girlfriends, although I am going to share with you some information that relates to his encounters with women coming over to his apartment. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're unfamiliar with me or with this channel, we do try to focus on ethical content creation. I am the author of 100 books, mostly on true crime. I'll put a link in the description to my Amazon author page if you're interested. If you find this episode meaningful, please like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So all of those words in the title image are accurate. He's been described as creepy, controlling, cruel, a bully, an addict, an insomniac. And in the previous episode, what I tried to do in a very, very simple way was show photos of Kohberger, just show his face, and then juxtapose those with pictures of the victims, and try to show you that in the one image you see someone who appears dull, who does not smile, who can't smile, who seems to live in a desaturated grayscale world, without friends, without any fun, with things that aren't particularly interesting or compelling, and there's not much life in his life. And then compare that to the vivid, vibrant, exciting, fun-filled, sexy, beautiful, sweet, joyful celebrations of these young women, and also Ethan, and just in terms of that palette, show the huge contrast, the sort of his black and white world. It's almost as though he lives on the moon, in this lonely place on the moon where everything's grey and dull, and he's jealous, he's envious of the world that these youngsters inhabit, and they're having such a great youth, and he hasn't had such a great youth. And because his envy has reached such a point, he now is angry and frustrated that he actually wants to destroy their world. Because he couldn't have it, he wants to destroy theirs. So what do we know about Kohberger beyond what some of the classmates and students have said? Well, apparently he was always doing something at night, right? And all night. And that can also give an idea how grim his life was. If he was up all night alone, what did that feel like? And, if you haven't gotten a sense of how lonely that is, believe me, that is lonely. As a creator, on the other side of the world, I often need to try and produce content at a time that you guys in America are awake. And that means I'm awake a lot more during the nighttime than I am in the daytime, which really throws my sleeping patterns for a loop. And then what that does is it creates a very isolating environment. You're awake when everyone else is asleep. And I'm doing it for work purposes. He was doing it for some other purposes. But it is a very lonely place to be. And what they say, idleness is the devil's workshop. So you can only imagine what was he doing through all of those hours at night? What was he reading? What was he looking at? And then eventually, how did that all sort of alloy into a kind of premeditation, some kind of plan? So from the New York Post, we get a sense that he usually kept to himself, but he could be heard at odd hours. And I think a neighbor said, quote, he's normally a very late night person, going to the bathroom and vacuuming at 1 or 12 in the morning. And this person who provided this information said, I have kids, so sometimes I thought of speaking to him or complaining, but never did. It seemed like he never slept because he was always doing something all night. And then she added, I don't know how he could have killed people because he doesn't look that tough. Right? She said, we are all PhD students here, so it takes a lot of hard work and smart to get to this point. You don't think someone like that could do something like this? That is such an important statement, and there's so much truth hidden, embedded in that statement. The crime itself was a statement to say, look how tough I am, right? If he doesn't look that tough, well, this crime was a way of redressing that. And if you think about how tough he was grading his students, that was also a demonstration of that.
He wanted it to be horrific. He wanted to be a violent attack against these women. Why? Because they were beautiful, vibrant, confident women. And he has, from what we understand now, difficulty having sexual relationships with these type of women. And that's what I'm saying. They've become proxies for his distaste or disgust and hatred against young, beautiful women.
So that is a retired FBI profiler talking about his distaste. And obviously it's a woman talking. But I think the part that she's missing is he's not only suffering from sexual frustration, he's suffering from a sort of generalized social death. His life isn't really happening in many respects. He doesn't have friends. He doesn't really have a life. And that is really what he's raging against. But it comes down to the expression of, the sexuality aspect is probably where he feels the most impotent and the most frustrated. But probably if he had the glue of very, very good friends, then probably he wouldn't feel so lonely and his life wouldn't be so grey and dull and hard and cold. So especially this portrait of this guy awake at night by himself, you kind of get the idea of a low profile loner. I feel like some advice that he could have done with is get a dog. Try to deal with your loneliness in a kind of a constructive way. Anyway, so going back to this article, quote, at first he moved in by himself and we thought his family would come later, but he lived there alone. And that is according to the neighbor, a lady who wanted to remain anonymous. She said she once saw someone who looked like a young female student get out of Kohberger's car. But she said then they parted ways and went to their own apartments. The neighbor, this lady who's providing the statement to the New York Post, who's also a graduate student, said that the accused killer would sometimes say hello to her. And she one time heard Kohberger bring a woman home. She said she couldn't see the woman, but the walls are thin, so she heard Kohberger and the woman talking. Doesn't sound like they did anything else besides that. And then what about the cruelty? According to the New York Times, quote, Kohberger grew up in suburban eastern Pennsylvania. He attended Pleasant Valley High School in Broadheadsville, where former classmates and peers recalled that he had an analytical mind but could sometimes be cruel. I've spoken often about this, and a lot of people laugh at me. They think it's, amateurish, simplistic, based on nothing. But I've often made the connection between sadism, and this was a particularly sadistic crime. Another way of just thinking about sadism is it's cruel, it's cruelty. But there's a very strong link between sadism and anality. Someone who's anal, someone who's very rigid in their lives, someone who lives in just a small little room, almost like a bare little room in the basement. And that's in terms of the house of their lives. They're only exploring and they're only experiencing a small part of what they should be. And that is something that is humiliating. That is something that is like a social death. When someone next to you is occupying all the rooms in their house, they are self-actualizing. And this person who then occupies this small little area, and they become more and more rigid, more and more controlling, more and more OCD, more and more of these efforts to control the anxiety, because when you're alone, anxiety increases. When you don't have the sakawa of social relationships, and we are social animals, it leads to just ordinary feelings of stress and anxiety and depression and all sorts of negative feelings and antisocial feelings. Now, Thomas Arntz befriended him while riding the school bus. That was around 2019, 13 years ago. And he could even remember back then that their friendship ended in 2014. So that seems like a 5-year friendship, but it ended after ribbing and jabbing became really mean-spirited. So it seems like there was light-hearted poking fun that became increasingly mean-spirited. And it eventually ended where Kohberger sort of sometimes put Arntz in a headlock hold, and obviously didn't like that. And so he said over time it just got so bad, this cruelty, this meanness, that he said, I just shut down when I was around him. Now think about that. He's 26 years old. He's thinking back when he was a 13-year-old teenager. And think of these words. He said, I eventually just had to cut ties with him. Think of those words. He had to cut ties with him. And in a way, one wonders whether what the killer did to these victims, wasn't that cutting ties in a way as well, saying, I've had enough of what you've done to me. And so I'm going to cut you. I'm going to cut you off, but I'm also going to cut you. I think another way that you can see how he struggled to deal with himself is with this heroin addiction. And that was something that began in high school, but he seemed to have moved past it in recent years. That's according to friends from Pennsylvania. But had he? What was he doing late at night when he was on campus? If the loneliness was getting too much, if the hours were stretching out too long, wouldn't he have been tempted to relieve some of that pain through something like heroin? Now, I'm not a drug addict, but I remember in the movie Trainspotting this idea where somebody says,
who needs reasons when you've got heroin?
From that same movie Trainspotting, he says, take the best orgasm you've ever had, multiply it by 1,000, and you're still not even close. And he's talking about heroin. Now, can you imagine having 4 years worth of heroin addiction? That incredible high, that incredible good feeling, followed by the dreariness that follows. How do you cope with life after heroin when everything and everyone is one big disappointment? It's all just one long train of dreariness. Jack Bayless, who became friends with Mr. Kohberger in 8th grade, I think this is according to the New York Times, said Kohberger had been fascinated with why people acted the way they did, and had seemed to enjoy his job as a security guard for the Pleasant Valley School District, where he worked for several years until 2021. So can you imagine going to school and then becoming a security guard for the school where you used to go to school? And meanwhile, what are you doing while that's taking place? By the way, a security guard is a job that can turn anyone into a natural stalker or peeping Tom. Now, according to the New York Times, the last time bailiffs saw Kohberger was in 2021 when they shot airsoft guns together in the Poconos. At that time, bailiffs said Kohberger was already driving a white Hyundai Elantra, the same model of car that the cops in Idaho spotted near the victim's home. Do you still think he's never hunted before? Another student, according to the New York Times, said Kohberger seemed interested in thought processes of criminals while they committed crimes, and he was less interested in the social factors that might lead people to do so. And I've got to say, a lot of my fellow creators don't seem particularly interested why a lot of incidents happen. We saw this in the Kylie Rodney case. No one was interested in the accident narrative and what was happening over there. That is something that is sorely missing in the true crime genre. No one seems to really be interested in the social factors that could lead to people doing something. They want to jump onto, as quickly as possible, explaining who someone is. They're a psychopath or a narcissist. This is their motive, whatever. They're not so interested in the process that led to someone becoming who they are. And that takes time. And what is really interesting, and I think tells us a lot about Kohberger, is that he believed some people were just bound to break the law. It seems as though he believed that was innate. And I think this weak psychology, this sense of almost self-determinism, probably was born to some extent in the time that he was a drug addict, because no one deceives like an addict. But what's also probably true is no one is as delusional as addicts are. What's also interesting is that one student described Kohberger as the black sheep of the class, someone who often took contrarian views and sometimes got into arguments with his peers, particularly women. What that kind of reveals is that he's got a chip on his shoulder regarding his fellow man, but in particular his fellow woman. That is absolutely par for the course for a incel scenario. One also has a sense that he lived with certain fantasies from an early age, like Dharma, and then finally gave in to them, like Dharma. We've also got a sense that he's got a temper problem. And you can imagine if someone isn't able to self-discipline themselves, isn't able to say no to drugs, easier said than done, but isn't able to rein themselves in, is used to giving in to their impulses. And I mean, that's what drug addiction is. Well, then part of that is they give in to their emotions as well. A classmate recalled one instance where Kohberger began explaining a fairly simple criminology concept to a fellow doctoral student. And I think it was probably a female student. And this student then accused him of mansplaining. And then there was apparently, according to the article, a heated back and forth between the doctoral student and Kohberger, and one of them eventually stormed out of the classroom. It's not clear which one, but the fact that it was heated tells you something. In terms of a chip on his shoulder, we know that he was a teaching assistant in a criminal law class during the fall semester, and that is according to Hayden Stinchfield, the guy we heard at the beginning of this episode. He's 20 years old, the same age as some of the victims, and was also one of the students in that class. He said Kohberger often cast his eyes down while addressing the students, giving the impression that he was uncomfortable.
He was pretty strict as far as grading goes. When he came into class, he was very, not super mentally present. He would stand up at the front, look at the ground. He had a lot of like boilerplate responses he would give people rather than, maybe something he had thought up on the spot. It seemed like he would be, he'd come in knowing what he was going to say to like most interactions. And then when he would grade your papers, he would be grading you on what he ended up calling like a higher standard. But what it really felt like to us was he was grading us like he would have graded himself as a PhD student. And so that was just kind of like, we were all annoyed by him. And so I knew his name, I knew like, oh, T.A. Bryan, like he sucks at this. Like he's grading us too harshly. And that was like an annoyance. But obviously beyond that, we just thought he was a little weird and kind of, a bad grader.
So can you see how you get the sense that the average student, the average kid just didn't really like him? that he was abrasive and not very nice to be around. But what that reveals is that he has a chip on his shoulder against his fellow man as well, not just against his fellow woman. And that was all too real. It wasn't just something bad that happened here. It was a daily grind for him. And can you see how it does suggest a generally covetous individual? At the very end, at the conclusion of the New York Times article, I'll put a link to it in the description, the reporter asks rhetorically, did this suspect act alone? What is the motive? I think we already know much that lies at the heart of both these questions. The first is simple enough, however. Not only did he act alone, he committed the act because he was so alone. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.